Hello, I'm International Master Andrew Martin, and welcome to this Foxy Openings DVD on the English opening. That's 1c4. The English is a flexible opening. It's quite aggressive, and it can be interpreted in many different ways. It is ideal for the needs of the average club player because it's my perception that at this level, black players don't often have to face the English, and therefore it can be used as a general weapon as long as you know the main ideas behind white's first move and the subsequent variations. Now on this DVD we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of inspiring and thematic games involving 1c4. I'll be taking you through the main themes of the opening so that when we've finished you'll be ready to go out and play the English. Possibly you would want to augment what's on this DVD with some further study. There's nothing wrong with that. This is the way to improve at chess, to study on your own. Okay, well it's time to get on with the show. I look forward to entertaining, amusing and educating you. Well, we start our investigation into the English opening with one of my favourite games involving 1c4. For this we go all the way back to 1988, to the USSR Championship as it then was, and playing white is the legendary Garry Kasparov. Playing black, the mercurial Vasily Ivanchuk. So two of the strongest players of all time duelling this game. At that time, of course, Kasparov was using the English on a regular basis. He prepared it extensively for his match against Anatoly Karpov in Seville 1987, and he used the English that match, as you'll recall, with devastating effect. So what we're about to see in this game is some preparation which Kasparov actually never got to unleash in that match. It's just that Ivanchuk was a victim of Kasparov's incredible preparation a year later. Well, basically black responds to the English with a very common setup, the simple four knights system. Black's approach isn't fancy, he just gets his pieces out, he's going to develop his bishop on f8 quickly, and he's going to castle. Absolutely straightforward. And he's asking white to prove an advantage against this very simple approach. Well, Kasparov played g3. This is, I would say, the most common move in this position. Although going back, e3 is a decent alternative, and there are quite a few other fourth moves for white as well. However, g3 is by and large the tried and trusted move for white here. White's approach is to try and dominate the d5 square. Now, Ivanchuk plays bishop b4, and when we think about control of d5, this is actually quite a logical move, because at some point black is thinking about whipping off that knight on c3 and then hopefully being able to play d5 himself, which breaks the shackles. Of course, going back to g3, black could play d5 straight away, after which we get more or less a Sicilian dragon in reverse after c takes d5, knight takes d5 and bishop g2. We will see examples of this as we go on through the DVD, because this is also quite a common line. But bishop b4 is more common yet, and there's nothing fancy about it, as we can see. Black is just getting the pieces out. Well, Kasparov played bishop g2. There is an alternative here in knight d5, but we're going to concentrate on bishop g2 because it's so straightforward. And if you're learning English or you're playing it for the first time, you should stick with the straightforward ideas. So both sides castle, and now black makes an energetic claim in the centre with e4. Well, white has two options here. He can go backwards with knight e1, or he can come forwards with knight g5. And this is a move which forces the exchange on c3, because white's hitting the pawn on e4 three times, and black can't defend it naturally other than to take off the knight on c3. Well, when black does this, of course, he doubles white's pawns. The pawns on c3 and c4 sometimes become liabilities in this position. But on the other hand, you often see black freeing his position up with d5 in this line, enabling black to free his game. One of the most important features of the position is the fact that white has acquired the bishop pair. So white, in this line, quite often seeks to make use of his dark square bishop. That's the piece black doesn't have. If white can operate on the dark squares in this position successfully, then he can often pin black down. But immediately, black has got to think about the pawn on e4, and so Ivanchuk plays rook e8. And now white plays the disruptive move, f3. Well, this is, again, a very logical move. You know, the pawn on e4 is getting in the way of the bishop on g2. So basically, white just makes an attempt to get rid of that pawn. And now comes a very interesting moment in the game. Ivanchuk played the very straightforward move, e takes f3. But if you'll recall that Kasparov-Karpov match, in game 2, Karpov unleashed the bombshell e3. And this is a move which white must take into account when he plays this system. It's quite an extraordinary pawn sacrifice. The idea is to jam up the white position. It's a very sharp gambit move. If white accepts that pawn on e3, he seriously weakens his pawn structure. And clearly he's got a lot of work to do before he can actually mobilise the rest of his pieces. For that reason, Kasparov in the match played d3 against Karpov after an extraordinarily long thinking time. And now there are quite a few interesting moves after d3. d5 is one such move, and now queen b3 is again a very, very sharp possibility, intending after knight a5 to go queen a3, and if c6, c takes d5, c takes d5, and now f4. Well, it's obvious that this is going to be a very difficult position to assess, because you begin to wonder, is this pawn on e3 strong or weak? And indeed, the whole assessment of the position, the correct assessment of the position, revolves round this feature. Going back to the move e3, allow me to suggest an extraordinary idea. Take the pawn, and if b6, as in the game Topalov versus Gelfand, Novgorod, 1997, e4 by white, h6 by black, and now the incredible move, knight takes f7. I think this would catch an unsuspecting opponent on the nose. This really is a fantastic way to play for white against this. I'm not sure it's 100% sound, but as you can see, it really does subject black to difficulty. The immediate threat is e5. Obviously, black can't take this pawn on e4 because of queen d5 check. So in the game Topalov versus Gelfand, Gelfand tried to crawl away with the move king g8. e5 was played, knight h7 by black, and now white can get a very strong attack together with the move f5. And this will lead to an incredibly unclear position. So this is really fascinating chess. Obviously, you know, this is a problem for black. He can't take on e5. If he takes on e5 with the knight, he loses his rook. If he takes on e5 with the rook, well, white can just take on c6. So that is, I wouldn't say an unknown option against e3, but it certainly turns the tables on black. And if we go back to the move knight takes f7, it just shows you that there are dynamic possibilities concealed in virtually every position in chess. You've just got to look for them. Kasparov himself, actually going back one more move to d takes e3, played this way in a game against Sadvakasov in Astana 2001. And after d takes e3, there Sadvakasov played queen e7 in place of the move b6. Then came knight h3. Kasparov played queen c5. White played knight f4, just allowing black to take on c4. And the idea is that white now goes e4. And he's gained control over the important d5 square. Yes, he's given black the pawn back. And if white, well, if white plays this way, he's got to be prepared to sacrifice a second pawn. But after rook b1, he has fantastic compensation, intending bishop b2. And now we can see that, you know, black is really struggling on the dark squares in this position. So again, white can think about turning the tables there by sacking a pawn. Actually, in this game, Kasparov versus Sadvakasov, after e4, if we just drop back to the position after e4, Sadvakasov recognised the dangers and decided to try and get his pieces out with d6. Then came queen to d3, knight to e5, queen takes c4, knight takes c4, g4, rook b8, rook d1, b6, g5, knight d7, and then knight d5, with a definite advantage to white, who is controlling the centre and, most importantly, has extended his control over d5. So there are some very interesting options in this line. I think that's what I'm saying to you. And now it's time to return to f3 and the more straightforward move, e takes f3, which is what Ivanchuk played. And now white took the opportunity to get his knight back from the dead by playing knight takes f3. So white has accomplished quite a large amount by playing f3. The f-file is now open for the rook. White's ready to play d4, expanding in the centre. Yes, he still has double c-pawns, but now Ivanchuk plays a move which, well, until this game was played, had been considered very satisfactory. The strong-looking move, d5. Yes, it does allow white to undouble his pawn straight away, although curiously, Kasparov doesn't take advantage of this. But if white does take on d5, then black gets very free play for his pieces. Now, 1 year after the Seville match against Karpov, Kasparov plays d4, one of his World Championship secrets. C takes d5, hitherto, had been considered the main line. Queen takes d5 then is a good move for black. And if knight d4, uncovering that bishop on g2, black goes queen h5. And I think black has pretty good play in this position. His light square bishop is ready to become extremely active here with moves such as bishop h3. And if white goes knight takes c6 in this position, black can simply recapture, given that bishop takes c6 is answered by rook takes e2. And now suddenly there's the threat of mate. So after queen h5, to cut a long story short, black has plenty of play with ideas of bishop h3 and bishop g4. So going back to d5, Kasparov didn't like any of that and started to look for better moves, hence d4. Knight e4. At this level of chess, the initiative is very important. It enables you to control events and stop your opponent from doing things to you. So knight e4 attacks the pawn on c3 and forces white to think about defence for the time being. Obviously black can take this pawn on c4. That has happened in a number of games. And white then has two interesting opportunities. He can play queen c2, which will be very similar to what Kasparov does in the game, or he can maybe even play a bishop to g5, which is again a very interesting possibility, taking advantage of the pin and noting that h6 is answered by bishop takes knight and then knight e5, uncovering an attack against the queen and beyond her against f7. So knight e4 by Ivanchuk and now queen c2 by Kasparov, both defending c2 and continuing to offer the c4 pawn, which Ivanchuk took. Now, it's pretty clear black can decline white's offer, and probably the most natural way of doing this is to play bishop f5. At least that's the move I will be looking at first if I was black, and certainly after that white's going to play knight h4. That is the idea. Now, probably the best move for black here is bishop g6. White whips that bishop off, black recaptures with the h-pawn. And despite white's bishop pair and apparent pressure, funnily enough, it's not that easy to take advantage of these positional trumps. Mainly because black's going to operate on one colour squares. When you're working against the two bishops, you really want all your pieces on one colour squares. So black is very much looking to operate on the light squares in this position. And he's going to consider moves such as knight a5, looking to operate on c4. You'll note that his rooks and his knights are already on light squares. The logic of this is that the bishop on g2 can't capture all these pieces or threaten all of them. So if you're operating on the light squares, the bishop becomes slightly overloaded in terms of what it's got to do. Well, this is a question of taste, this position. It's a position where, frankly, I would not mind being white. I mean, for instance, one way white could play is to play queen d3, protecting c4. If black goes knight a5, we can take on d5. Queen takes d5, and now we're fighting for the initiative after rook f4, f5, and now g4. Something like this. White can still play in this position. it just leads to a very interesting and uncompromising struggle. I mean, you can see why Ivanchuk might not go in for this against somebody like Kasparov. You know, basically, black's position is sound at the moment, but white can work with the bishop pair to gradually extend his advantage. He's got ideas now like rook b1 and then rook b5. It's a very unclear, interesting and rich position. So there's plenty going on, which would probably have suited both players. But, you know, even Ivanchuk fears Kasparov. I mean, that's what d takes c4 says to me. And he's looking for the easiest way to dampen down the coming white initiative. However, white's next move, again, is a product of this Karpov preparation. And rook b1 is a really excellent move. Kasparov trying to tie down the bishop on c8. And basically, I think white intends to operate in the centre. He's going to try and get rid of that knight on e4 and then dominate by playing e4 himself. But for the time being, he knows that, well, he better tie down the bishop on c8 because that just stops all the black pieces from coming out. So rook b1 is a good move. And now with the bishop consigned to defence on c8, black's got to find another way of reinforcing his knight, hence the move f4. But Kasparov was ready for this, and he hits with the really excellent move here, g4. Well, this again is Kasparov's preparation for the Karpov match. You have to really admire this guy's work rate and the way he discovered new ideas. I mean, this was his legacy to chess, and g4 is just such a brilliant move. Queen e7 by Ivanchuk. Little did he know what was in store for him. If f takes g4 in this position, knight e5 is possible. And if knight takes e5, we go bishop takes e4. Now there's a double hit on both e5 and h7. Some games went the way of knight g6. White was happy to get his queen into the business area. And basically this is a position for black to avoid. There was a game Le Siege versus Zujic, which went queen e7. And now rook to b5. With the intention of swinging that rook across to the king side to join the party. Queen e6 was played in this game. Queen h5. Black interrupts white's scheme for a minute. But, you know, this sort of position is, you know, something which black should avoid. Opposite colour bishops on the board. Black is a really lousy pawn up. But you can see, white's got all the chances. And white's got ideas such as rook e5 coming up. He's got rook g5 coming up. It's absolutely horrible for black. So, strong players feel a lot at the board. I mean, I'm not sure Ivanchuk would have seen that variation to the extent that we've investigated it today. But, you know, he feels that this might be a very dangerous continuation to go in for against Kasparov. Hence, queen e7. But this is a rather simplistic approach to the position. G takes f5. Knight d6. Well, again, we must pause and take a look now at bishop takes f5. There, Kasparov was intending knight g5. And this really does strike at the root of black's position. The light squared domination in the centre. If bishop g6, well, you know, black has some serious problems in this position with b7. White can just trade a lot of pieces off and go perhaps rook takes b7. If black goes g6 to defend himself, we have knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, queen takes e4, rook takes e4, and now rook takes b7. And white has numerous threats, perhaps the most potent of which is the idea of bishop h6 followed by rook takes c7, domination of the 7th rank, and a direct attack against black's king. So knight d6, trying to batten down the hatches, and you have to agree this does look tempting because suddenly black has an attack against f5, threatening bishop takes f5, which would win the exchange, and secondly black is threatening queen takes e2. So it does look as though Ivanchuk is getting out of this mess. But knight g5. The bishop is uncovered on g2. And when black went queen takes e2, Kasparov had a very nice combination prepared. He went bishop d5 check. King h8. And perhaps now, slightly surprisingly, exchanged the queens on e2. Well, it's not really a surprise if you're a strong player, because what white is doing now is changing the nature of the game. He's basically saying, well, look, my pieces are in such dominating positions, and your development is so retarded that, you know, I'm going to have a strong initiative come what may. You can't play this position normally. And I think that's right. I think Ivanchuk's king is under such pressure here. And, you know, the threat of bishop takes d6 is actually quite compelling, followed by knight f7 check. So, black cannot find time to develop his queenside in this position. It really is as simple as that. So, knight d8. Pretty nasty to have to play this move. I think after bishop takes f5, white's continuation would probably be the same, just bishop takes d6, and black is not long for this world. So knight d8 in a futile attempt to cover f7, and now the excellent rook b e1, just exchanging off black's active piece. I mean, it really is as simple as that. Not sure what to say. Rook takes e1 was played, rook takes e1, bishop d7, bishop takes d6, simple chess. C takes d6, rook comes into e7, and now the crowning point of Kasparov's sacrifice and play beforehand, the beautiful move f6, a final sacrifice which actually compels Ivanchuk's resignation. Black resigned in this position, not wishing to investigate. Bishop takes d5, rook e8, bishop g8, f7, and when we take this combination to its logical conclusion, we reach a beautiful smothered mate after knight takes f7. So for me, that was an inspiring game by Garry Kasparov. To crush Ivanchuk in this manner is by no means easy. Many have tried, many have failed. He managed it through a combination of superb awareness and fantastic preparation. So if that doesn't inspire you to play the English, then really nothing will. Black has many different systems with which he can meet the English, and one of these is just to copy what white's doing, to play the symmetrical English. My next game therefore shows how white might meet this method, and in particular combat the hedgehog. Now, this coming game comes from the Rouen Open, played in August 2009. Playing white is Jan Adamski, and playing black, Marcin Pietraszewski. And, well, the opening soon went into hedgehog territory. Now, the hedgehog is a very interesting setup, where black lies on the ropes for the time being, just develops modestly, initially in the style of the Queen's Indian, plays his bishop to e7, he castles, and he sets up a pawn front on his third rank. Black generally has pawns on d6, b6, e6, a6, keeping white at bay. And the idea is that black is able to develop economically within 3 ranks and repel any premature white attacks. The graveyards are littered with the corpses of white players who have tried to attack too soon against black's very resilient setup. Now, in this particular game, white employs the main line against the hedgehog, pushing forward in the centre with d4. And this is a very common idea in the English. White doesn't execute d4 immediately, he plays it at the best possible moment convenient to him. And, well, d4 is a very logical move in this position. White doesn't intend the weedy knight takes d4 in this position. He's ready to take back with the queen. And he's actually quite happy to allow black the possibility of playing knight c6, after which he plays queen f4, and black's got a slight problem with his d-pawn. White continues very logically with rook across to d1 and puts pressure on the d-file. Black can obviously exchange queens in this position with queen b8 and then for instance go queen takes f4, but there's no doubt about it, white has a distinct edge in this position. So a lot of grandmasters avoid this variation. So going back to our game, black played the main line with d6, and after bishop g5, which is my recommended move against the hedgehog, black played a6. So this is a very typical hedgehog formation. Given time, black's simply going to develop his pieces. He'll play his knight to d7, he'll castle, and he will await events flexibly. Well, what Adamski does in this game is employ a relatively new idea of the Hungarian grandmaster Ribley, where he takes on f6 straight away and drops his queen back to d3. Incidentally, just dropping back one move, white could have played queen f4 as well. That has been played with success, but I guess I don't want to allow black the possibility of playing bishop takes c3. That may be good for white, but why should I allow him to double my pawns? Well, the idea in this line is to mount pressure against the d pawn, so that's exactly what white did. And now we see the power of d4. The file has been opened, the d file, and white is able to put pressure on that file. Black dropped his bishop back to e7. I'm sure he hadn't overlooked white's next move, but nevertheless it is a powerful idea. Knight g5. Now white attacks h7 and b7 too. Of course, black can easily diffuse this idea by taking on g5, but white's continuation is bishop e4, and by these means he probes the black king side. Well, I think this ensures white at least a small edge in this position. In opposite colour bishop middle games, the initiative is of key importance, and black has still to develop the knight on b8. Black might argue, well, I've got no real weaknesses in my position, but bishop e4 provokes the weakness. For instance, in the game, black played f5. That looks like a slightly ugly move to me, with central pawns waiting to be attacked. But it's true that after g6, I think white would go h4, and when the bishop retreats, h5. And, well, you know, black is getting probed anyway. So, black went f5, bishop came back to g2, and black dropped back to e7 to defend his pawn. f4, knight d7, and now e4. So white has completely taken over the centre. Again, a very common idea in the English. Black has failed to come to terms with white's aggressive play. He hasn't equalised. He's still manoeuvring in his own three ranks, and far from keeping white out, the hedgehog pawns are now starting to look rather weak and vulnerable. Well, black took on e4. If he goes knight c5, which seems to me to be a slightly better try, I think queen e3 still ensures an advantage to white. I mean, black can continue trading and hope that he can hold this opposite colour bishop position. But there's no doubt about it. The central pawns are very weak. White has an undisputed advantage. So f takes e4. Knight takes e4. And black is really feeling the pressure now on d6. d5 was played. An attempt to solve black's problems tactically. C takes d5, and now the knight comes up to c5. Queen e2. White is happy with small gains in this position. He understands that if black takes back on d5, he's going to lose that d pawn anyway, whatever he plays. So black tries to get active by exchanging the knights and playing bishop c5 check. However, white's king is as safe as houses on g2, and now what is black to play? He cannot resolve the problem of his d pawn. He tried. E takes d5. White captured back with the rook. A clear pawn up now, and pressing ahead. Again, a tactical solution to the position. If bishop takes c5 in this position, queen c4 is very embarrassing. A hit on the bishop and discovered check is very much in the offing with the rook, and queen b2 check doesn't help. Rook d2, discovered check, and black loses his queen. So black drops off the pace with bishop e7. Rook comes to f5. Of course, white is now pushing black around. Queen b8, and now rook h5, emphasising the nature of opposite colour bishop positions. g6, and now the splendid move, rook takes h7, which completely finishes black off. Black resigned. Let's just see why. If he takes on h7, queen h5 check. It really is very easy now. King g7, queen takes g6, king h8, and now queen h7 mate. So an excellent and thematic game by white. Shows the value of delaying d4 to the best possible moment. Let's not forget that after 20 or so moves, white had completely taken over the centre. notwithstanding the fact that he opened with the English, well, knight f3 and c4 transposing to the English, and a nice culminating attack. Now the English is very transpositional, or can be. You can go back into regular flank opening positions or queen's pawn positions, especially at the drop of a hat. At least that's my impression. White, when he's trying to form a repertoire with the English, must be well aware of transpositional possibilities at virtually every stage. However, when you play c4, there's no guarantee on the black side that something original isn't going to turn up on the board. And I think my next game is going to illustrate this point quite nicely. It comes from the Turin Olympiad in 2006, and playing white is Grandmaster Mikhail Gurovic, very strong player, 26-43, and playing black, the veteran Grandmaster from Bosnia, Bojan Karaitsa. And you'll quickly see, only after a couple of moves, that the game is heading into original territory, as white brings his knight out to c3, with the typical English idea of not exactly dominating the d5 square, but certainly focusing on that square early on. And black plays his bishop out to b4, which is, how can I put it, not quite the Nimzo Indian, because of course white is under no obligation to play d4 himself. And Gurovic, of course, is quite happy to develop the game along original lines, and therefore brings his queen out to b3. So here we have almost an uncharted position, well, a very unusual one, after only 3 moves. Now if I drop back to bishop b4, certainly in this position black intends to double white's pawns with, say, bishop takes c3. So for instance, if white were to play a move like knight f3 here, then black could even consider taking on c3 straight away and just playing a kind of structural game where he aims to put all his pawns on dark squares, something like this, and by so doing gets a nice solid position. Okay, white's got 2 bishops, but he's got defects in his pawn structure. Now all this stuff is really a question of taste, but in general I think white is well advised to steer clear of those double pawn positions, and therefore queen b3 is one way to do it. White could have played queen c2, but that doesn't have the same impact, I would say, because of course on b3 the queen's attacking the bishop. c5, just one way to protect the bishop, and now white plays a3, trying to encourage black to surrender the bishop pair. Of course bishop takes c3 now doesn't really make much sense. Then white would certainly recapture with the queen, and he keeps his pawn structure together. Basically he gets the 2 bishops for free. There is another move here, and that's knight b5. Again, white is very pointed. He focuses on the d6 square. And in the game Pelletier versus Rombaldoni, which was played in 2006 in France, black actually allowed him to play the check, hoping that, you know, white had wasted an enormous amount of time taking off a bishop which hadn't moved. Well, that may be so, but I still prefer white's game here, with 2 bishops, and black's king slightly inconvenienced. Pelletier went on to win this game. So that's another possibility after c5. Going back to Gurovic-Karaitsa now, a3 was played, and black isn't in any hurry at all to give the bishop up, so he goes bishop a5. And now, a further original twist, white plays knight e4. So, although this had been seen before our current game, you know, I think you'll agree that, well, how can I put it? It's a highly original position. You know, both players are thrown on their own resources at a very early stage, and well, I think Gurovic was simply hoping to outplay Karaitsa by creating something weird like this. Now, when you come to a position which you haven't seen before, or basically is out of your comfort zone, or at least that's what Gurovic is trying to do to Karaitsa, to take him out of his comfort zone, you've got to note various things about the position. I mean, if I was just given this position and, say, asked to assess it, I would notice several things. I don't like the position of black's bishop offside. I note that black has a weak pawn on g7. The white queen is very well placed to slide along the 3rd rank, possibly to take advantage of that feature. We often see this in games where a bishop leaves the roost early, is driven to the side of the board. Well, there are certainly weaknesses on g7 for black to consider. Obviously, black has a pawn on c5 on pre, and he's got knight d6 check to think about as well. So black is being given opportunities to go wrong early on, and this is the essence of what white is doing. And sure enough, Karatsa, I wouldn't say goes wrong, but let's say rises to the challenge with knight f6. I think that move would not have been my first choice. But then going back, how does black actually defend this pawn on c5 comfortably? Given that the move d6 here, I think fails as described to queen g3. And now black has 2 pawns on pre on d6 and g7. This is how quickly black can come into trouble. There was a game, Kirill Georgiev versus Adler, 2 strong players, where black played queen c7. White played queen g3 anyway. Obviously that encourages the exchange of queens. Black plays knight a6, and now b3. And I think white is certainly better in this position. The game continued, bishop c7, bishop b2, f6 to block the long diagonal, and now just simply e3 and then d4. Okay, this is not too much for white, but it's my impression that the white position is slightly more together. Black's got very strangely placed pieces. White's rook on h1 is already in the game. And just to show you how this game continued, Georgiev Adler, black played knight e7. White established a wedge in the centre with d5. Of course, it's impossible to capture that pawn twice because the knight on a6 would hang. Bishop e5, castles on the queen side, bishop takes c3. Black took on d5. Now again, taking on d5 is not really permitted because of rook takes d5 and then bishop takes a6. So d6, bishop b5, check, king f7, e4. And white was solidly better with the bishop pair. Okay, well, going back to our game then, I think Karatsa has been caught firmly and squarely on the nose, and now he's trying to brazen his way out with original play of his own. But white is not to be bluffed. He takes the pawn on c5. I mean, this is clearly a gambit by black. He's obviously trying to argue that, you know, he's whipping up a lead in development. He's got threats such as knight c6, and there's a little trap for white to fall into for here. If white goes in for a further orgy of pawn grabbing with knight takes b7, then, well, actually, he loses his queen after rook b6. But what can we expect? I mean, if you're going for suicidal pawn grabs like that, you deserve everything you get. So going back to knight c6, I think white's got to note black's threat of knight d4, and in the game Gurevich played e3. He could have gone knight f3, but I think the reason he didn't do that was probably queen e7 and then e5. When the knight on f3 doesn't look that comfortable, I think black is ready to push white around here with e4, and then he's going to put his knight in on d4 anyway. So that really would have justified black's pawn sacrifice. You know, white's got to be careful here. White's got to be careful. So as befits a very strong grandmaster like Gurevich certainly is, a good technical player as well, he notes all these details in the position and he plays the more cautious move e3. Mainly to stop the impact of e5, the impending e5, e4, should that knight ever come out to f3. Well, anyway, the game continues to take an original course with black hitting the knight on c5, gaining time. White brings his knight to a4, very peculiar positions arising here. Black is continuing to develop very quickly, and now white plays queen c2. So after 9 moves, I mean, I think the independent characteristics of the English are shining through here by both players. White is a pawn up, but, well, his development is retarded almost. On the other hand, he's got no weaknesses, and black has got to force the pace here, lest he end up a pawn down for nothing. Well, as the game goes, Karatsa fails to really get any compensation, any tangible compensation. White manages to play b4 and bishop b2 free of charge. And now black plays a6. The idea behind a6 is that, well, black is simply threatening to take on c4 here. So white deals with this by just taking on d5, ridding himself of the problem of the c4 pawn, and then just brings his bishop out to e2. So simple play. Knight e4. Okay, what is the idea of this? Well, I think the main idea behind knight e4 is to give the queen an avenue to come out to the king side. She may come to g5 or h4. In both cases, white is being subjected to pressure. Now, you may think, I mean, when I first saw this game, I thought knight f3 was obligatory. In fact, Gurevich didn't do that, but knight f3 seems to fit the bill in terms of a good move. It stops the queen of ventures, and it develops, threatens to castle. But the fact is, after that, I think black can get some good counterplay together by bringing his bishop out to g4, and then putting his knight on g5. Black has definite compensation for the pawn here. It reminds me, in some ways, of the freedom of play white gets in the Tarrasch defence to the Queen's Gambit. Sorry, black, excuse me. And black definitely has compensation for his pawn here. That knight on a4, where's white going to put his king? Pressure against f3. Yeah, there's no doubt, and of course black is threatening now to bring his rooks into the game. Certainly a rook will appear on c8 very quickly. The white queen might be embarrassed. Back to knight e4. d3 was played by Gurevich. Knight g5, and now the difference, h4. Gurevich seems determined to create something highly original in this game. And the way that he delays the development of the knight on on g1 is particularly interesting from my point of view. Well, the knight comes back to e6. Not ideal. It obstructs the bishop on c8 and it obstructs the queen. d4. White takes the centre. Possibly he's thinking about knight c5. Bishop d7. Straightforward. Good. The knight on a4 is being observed, and black is going to bring a rook to c8 very quickly. Finally, the knight comes into the game. And now rook a d8. Well, that is a peculiar one. You know, I would have thought at least he would have put a rook on c8 in this position. Maybe rook a c8 or even rook f c8. One or the other. I think after that, probably white would have to move his queen. Knight c5, the knight can be ejected from there with the move b6. So it is very strange to me that Kuroitsa played his rook to d8 in this position. Of course, that encourages knight c5, and now I think white is solidly better. I don't see any compensation for the pawn, really. I think white has actually managed to outplay black in this opening, using all these original effects. I don't see really why black shouldn't just be a pawn down for nothing here. And the next move confirms Kuroitsa's state of mind here as he plays rook b8. I mean, I think that shows a certain hesitancy. It shows that he doesn't really understand what he should be doing in this position. I mean, any move apart from rook b8 really would have attracted me. I mean, I think when you've gone rook a d8, to go rook b8 on the next move really is just backing down, isn't it? And you can't win games of chess by backing down. Certainly not against good opponents. You've got to take the fight to them. So, well, there's no doubt about it. Taking on c5 is most unattractive. You know, white just plays d takes c5. He's got the long diagonal. Probably black has to block this diagonal. And now I think just rook d1. This is a solid pawn up. There's no route through for black to get to white's king. Queenside pawn majority should hold the day. That doesn't really look satisfactory. Bishop c8. Wow. Again, a very lousy move, I think. Knight takes a6 exploits that. And after b takes a6, I don't see any reason why white shouldn't just take the knight. Again, material ahead, no compensation. So perhaps Kuroitsa has gone wrong already. I think this is what we can say. That rook a d8 move was a definite mistake. But then he was a pawn down, and there was no obvious route for him to get it back. But rook b8, well, white can play it simply. And this is exactly what Gurevich did. He took off the bishop on d7. And now he castled. Well, white would much rather have his pawn on h2 in this position, but you know, you can't have everything in chess. And, well, the pawn on h4 is solidly protected. Black has no way to attack it effectively. The assessment stands. White is a pawn up. So, black's got to do something. He plays f6. He plays g6. White was threatening h7. Just rook fe1. Quiet improvements. are the order of the day. And now just g3. Gurevich really is excellent at this technical phase. The main idea behind g3 is to solidify the king position and really to target d5. There's no shame in white for going backwards. I think he's just intending to put that bishop on g2 and then to pile up on d5. If black is forced into a defensive position here, then, well, it really will be hopeless. Bishop b6. Bishop f1. The plan takes shape. Queen d6. Rook a d1. No chink of light in white's position. Rook b c8. The queen is happy to move, noting the d5 pawn. Knight goes back. Rook e2. Where's the rush? Where's the fire? No rush at all. White unhurriedly builds up. Black can do nothing apart from not making his position worse. I mean, this is how grandmasters play when they know they've got a bad position. They don't just lash out. Black would love to be able to create counterplay here and actually do something, but everything's under control for white. He just continues to strengthen his position, to torture black. And you know, black is really struggling here to find things to do. Well, h6. Finally, black finds something to do. He announces his intentions of playing g5 and perhaps trying to attack the white king side. But as usual in this type of position, you know, when you actually try to do something, it makes your position worse because, you know, white's king position is as solid as a rock. What justification does black have here for lashing out like that? Queen b1. Noting the small change in the pawn structure. Now it's white who could be focusing his attention on the black king. And certainly white might be thinking of moves like h5 himself to soften up the poor old black king. So that explains the next move, knight f8, purely defensive gesture. And now knight e1. Black has problems in this position. The knight is ready to tour the board. He's coming up to d3, after which there are two very juicy squares on f4 and c5 to occupy. So g5, there's really nothing to it, nothing for it. Black's got to go for it. This is the point where black was lost before, but he was hanging on. Now he understands that if he doesn't do something, it will be all over very quickly. And so he's got to take a risk. In comes the white queen. Up comes the white knight. And finally into the dream square on c5. So excellent manoeuvring by Gurevich. Knight f8. And now e4. In effect, the winning move. White finds exactly the right moment to open up the game and get after poor old black's king. g5 was very weakening, but of course it takes play of a high order to exploit the weakness. White's not going to get anywhere with his queen and knight alone. He's got to open up the position for the rest of his pieces, and that's exactly why e4 is so effective. So knight e7, queen g4, queen b8, and now e5, taking a can-opener to the black king side. King g6, strip open the king, thank you very much. Bishop d2, eyeing g5. Bishop takes c5, well, black didn't have any satisfactory way of defending it anyway. Off comes the pawn, and now it really is hopeless. Two bishops, two pawns up, and the black king is naked. Really, there's no way back. And so Gurevich now strolls to victory. Bishop e4, lovely move. King f6, just noting d takes c3. Bishop takes g6 check. Knight takes g6. And then a rather unusual fork, queen f5 check, after which one of the knights has to go. So bishop e4 was played, nice move. King f6, bishop takes g6, knight takes g6, bishop b2, simple stuff. Knight e5, f4, knight c6, rook e1. Once those rooks get into the game, it's really hopeless. Queen g5 check, king f7, rook e4, rook d7, king g2, b6, f5. Now queen g6 check is coming, queen b7, f6, knight e6. Possibly Gurevich was in time trouble. It's difficult to explain why black has been playing on over the last few moves, but after rook takes e6, everything becomes totally clear. So black resigned. Why does he resign? Well, there's no discovered attack with the black knight here. That's check, but the pawn effectively blocks the check and consigns black to the dustbin. So that was a very interesting game. I mean, in all its phases, it was different, it was original, and it shows the independent nature of the English opening when white insists. Mind you, black played his full part in the creation of an original position in this game. I mean, I don't think we should criticise Karatsa that sharply. He did his best, and well, on the day, Gurevich was the better player. As we've seen, you do tend to get original situations using it, and white's position is generally rock solid at most stages of the opening situations. So it's difficult for black. A lot of weak players, or not weak players, weaker players, they groan inwardly when they see white's played c4, because they know it's going to be very, very difficult to launch any tactical strikes against white's solid opening. And so the English, what I think I'm saying, can be fireproof if you want it to be. And certainly Svitten in this game uses it basically to, how can I put it, rabbit bash. The guy with black is completely outplayed. He tries to spice things up in the opening very early on with d5. It's not an especially good move, d5. But again, black can transpose into some sort of Tarrasch or Queen's Indian using this way of playing, but that's about the best he can do. Now, I don't think spicing it up against the English is possible, and just by playing sensible moves, white gets a very good game very quickly. And that's exactly what Svitten does in this game. He takes on d5, bringing the black knight into an exposed position, and now he plays knight f3. Well, pawn up to c5. You know, black can try to encourage white into going back into various openings. I mean, he can try to encourage him to go back into a Grunfeld with something like g6. Well, as we'll see in the next game, queen a4 check is quite an interesting way of playing against this way. Going back to knight f3, I suppose black could go e6. He does something very similar in the game. If he takes on c3, well, white captures back with the b pawn, and all black has accomplished is to strengthen the white centre. Again, something like this happens a bit later on down the line in Svitten versus Arndt. But at every stage, black is lacking really dynamic counterplay. He just gets a position where it's possible for white to outplay black, you know, without the slightest risk. It's not often you find that, you know, especially when you play 1e4 or d4. Well, again, with 1e4, you're always going to encounter heavily theoretical situations. When you play d4, again, there are all sorts of very sharp openings for black, like the Grunfeld or the Benoni, or all sorts of gambit opportunities, Budapest maybe, or things like that. And well, this way round, a lot of the tactics, a lot of the fun is taken out of black's game. So g3, nothing better for black than to just go into some sort of semi-Tarrasch position. That's exactly what he does. Castles, castles, and now having got to a standard position, white decides to play d4 and go back into the semi-Tarrasch. b6. Well, with this move, black shows a slight lack of familiarity with the position. It's more normal here to go knight c6. I think after that, white can probably take on d5, then take on c5. This is now a semi-Tarrasch where black has inherited an isolated pawn. This is not the type of position to go in for against a Grandmaster. I think it's the wrong choice. Maybe Grandmaster versus Grandmaster, where the player with black understands how to play these isolated queen's pawn positions. Yes, you can do this. And yes, this might be a reliable weapon for black. But it's my impression that the weaker player is just going to get outplayed in a position of this type. There's just not enough going on to disrupt the Grandmaster's natural train of thought. I should stress at this point that if you want to get a result against a much higher rated player than yourself, by far the best way is to create complications. Well, there are simply not enough complications in this position to justify having the isolated pawn. So I suppose that's why black goes b6. He's trying to find something original, but, well, he just runs into straightforward moves now. Having delayed the moves d4 and e4, Svitten plays them at the right moment and forces black to cede the centre. So after b takes c3, I think we can safely say that white has a definite advantage. He's got the centre. This must count for something in chess, and it's easier for white to develop his pieces. This freedom of action gives white a definite edge. Knight a6. Pawn to h4. Tit for tat. If that knight goes to the edge of the board on the queen side, white shows his intentions perhaps on the king side. h4 in itself, well, it's rather vague for me what exactly that does, but it's a kind of a scary move for black. He looks at this move and he thinks, now what's he up to? You know, I really didn't expect that. I expected some move like bishop f4, or, you know, I may have expected some move like even a4, something like that. But I didn't expect h4. And then doubts begin to creep in. Svitten actually manages to use h4 in a sly way a little later on, but his intentions are not clarified. It's just an interesting psychological move from h4. It forces black to worry about perhaps things which aren't even there in the position. Anyway, rook c8, bishop f4, rook e8. So black can't think of what to do, just shunts his rooks into the game. And now white plays rook b1. Bishop d6, all looks normal. Svitten retreats with bishop d2, confirming that h4 had no real plan in mind, other than to maybe run black down on the clock and force him to think about, you know, stuff really which doesn't exist. So bishop d2 just says, well, I'm going to keep the pieces on against you. Your bishop on d6 is clumsy. You show me why you put the bishop there. And that's exactly what black tries to do. Queen c7. But now I begin to wonder what that knight's doing on a6. Rook b2, covering the second rank in case black was ever thinking of taking on d4 and then plunging his queen down to c2. Rook e to d8. And now bishop h3. So white is managing to use his move h4. The white configuration on the queen side is rather on the king side is rather pleasing. You know, white's covering an awful lot of squares. So bishop h3, well, d5 is now the idea in the forefront of white's mind for sure. So that's why black goes rook b8, getting out of the way. Bishop f1, toing and froing. Rook a8, black can't think of what to do, and now white goes bishop g5, probing black's position. Well, I've no doubt at all that Arndt didn't want to play f6 against the Grandmaster, weakening his king side, so he offers the exchange of dark squared bishops. And Svitten is happy to oblige, as he's now ready with the central breakthrough d5, forcibly creating a passed pawn, and of course attacking the black queen, so the black queen moves. Rook d2. White now has a very strong trump in the form of a passed pawn, which is about to be supported with the move c4. Seeing c4 coming up, black moves in to take a pawn, but he runs slap bang into a very rapid white attack. Having got his rooks on the central files, Svitten, well, now starts an outright attack against the black king position, firstly hitting the bishop on b7, bishop retreats, and now knight e5, opening up fire against f7. The problem for black is it's actually worse than it appears, because after knight b4, actually white doesn't even take on f7, he just plays a3. He's going to drive that knight away, and when the knight retreats, well, now I think a capture on f7 starts to look very strong indeed, and also queen h5 might well be in the wings. So black plays f6. Knight comes to c4. There's a little bit of tactical interplay, but Arndt missed the next move. Rook e3. Oh dear, he has no square for his queen. So knight d3, bishop takes d3, king f8 to evade the threat of bishop takes h7 check. Black can't take on c4. King f8, bishop f1, rook d6, a comical and rather futile move to end the game, and simultaneously after playing the worst move on the board, black resigned. Now, that was by no means a great game, but it was comprehensive defeat for Arndt. I mean, he never really got into the game. And this is how the English can reward you when you play it against a weaker player. So it's definitely a good opening to play if you just want to outplay your opponent without taking any risks. It worked out very well for Svitten in this game, and I think he uses it as such in a lot of his open tournament games. Well, I suppose we could have called the last game not quite the Nimzo Indian. Now we come to not quite the Grunfeld, as we come now to a world-class encounter. Playing white in this game, Levon Aronian, one of the world's best players currently, 2-7-5-7. Playing black, Gatakamsky, who, though he's come out of retirement a few years ago from a long period out of the game, is showing us that he's as strong as he ever was. And this game comes from the European Team Championship played in October 2008, so a relatively recent game. And although the opening starts out as a reti, we quickly go back into English territory, with white bringing out both his knights, and now black offering a transposition black into the Grunfeld defence, an opening which is scoring very well for black at the highest levels of chess currently. Well, white takes on d5, knight takes d5, and there's no real need now for white to play d4 and go back into a Grunfeld. There, everything is charted, everything is known. There's an awful lot of theory to recall on this variation. The Grunfeld is one of the most heavily theoretical openings of all. No, instead, Aronian goes his own way with the independent English move, Queen a4 check. And I think this is a move which can actually be recommended to white. It's a move which causes a little bit of inconvenience, I would say, in the black camp, and forces black to think originally at a very early stage of the game. Now, black has a number of options here, but his task is not at all as simple as it might appear. I mean, this is not just a check, let's say. Well, okay, what is the idea of this check? Well, it's to force black to make an awkward interposition. For instance, if black plays knight c6 in this position, white goes knight e5. And already, this is a little bit awkward. Well, if black plays bishop d7, then white will just take off the bishop with a nice solid advantage. Two bishops, no problems, and plenty to look forward to. So I think black can do better than that, of course, with bishop d7. And now it's a question of where white goes from here. Well, in this particular game, Aronian decided to swing his queen across to h4. And that gives the game even more of an original slant. Just going back, white can also play queen b3 in this position, with a double attack on the knight and the pawn at b7. With the idea that if black goes bishop c6, well, again, white can go knight e5 and nab the bishop pair. That's another game, another day. Aronian prefers queen h4. Well, okay, Kamsky takes on c3. B takes c3. Bishop g7. And now rook b1. Grunfeld-like, but, as I said in the introduction, not quite a Grunfeld. White has cunningly delayed the development of his central pawns. He will fashion the centre as he himself wishes. Don't forget, one of the main ideas in the Grunfeld for black is that as soon as white goes d4, black is ready to respond with c5 and chip away at the white centre, opening out opportunities for the bishop on g7. Well, this way round, white is creating pressure before black can get to grips with the white centre with c5. And already rook b1 forces a concession. You know, if black plays bishop c6 in this position, he's actually getting in the way of his c-pawn. So Kamsky plays b6, but you begin to wonder with the bishop on d7 whether b6 is a move black wants to make in this current situation. So, of course, now, having changed the position, made it radically different from the Grunfeld, white is happy to play d4 and take the centre after h6 and then e4. Now, you may have wondered why, if we just drop back one move, a world-class grandmaster is going h6 here. Well, I think the main idea is to stop white from playing bishop h6. I mean, you know, one idea that white has in the Grunfeld positions of this type is that, you know, if he can take away black's fianchetto bishop, a lot of the influence that black can bring to bear against the white centre is diminished, and therefore white has the freedom to roam around the board once he's got control of the centre, full control. So Kamsky has to take time out here to prevent bishop h6, and the only way he can think of doing this is to play h6 himself, which doesn't look that great, to be absolutely honest. I suppose the only thing white's got to watch out for in this line is that his queen doesn't become exposed on h4. So black is thinking all the times about jabs such as g5 at the right moment, possibly, you know, that has to be very well timed in order for it to work, and moves like e6, which would force the exchange of queens. I think black would be happy to get the queens off at this stage if he could, but well, until he castles, and actually with h6 on pre, it's not easy to see him casting that quickly. Black has some technical problems in organising his pieces. Kamsky continues in Grunfeld style with c5. White brings his bishop out very naturally to e3, and now black plays queen c7 and then knight c6. So it's definitely looking a lot more like the Grunfeld now, but with the moves queen h4 and h6 chucked in, I mean, white's queen would normally be on d2 in this situation. She looks far more dangerously posted from black's perspective on h4, as far as I can see. And black would normally have castled, which of course makes it a lot easier to organise his position. The fact that black can't castle in this position that easily is really going to give Kamsky some problems as the game progresses. Well, bishop e2 was played, rook c8, and now white castled, completing his development with an advantage. Bishop f6, and now queen g3. So this is a small victory for black, but having won this small battle, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to win the war, because white still has full control of the centre, and black is still to castle. He can't castle, of course, because his h6 pawn would hang. So this forces another small concession. That's the pawn push g5, and now white starts to take over the initiative before black gets his king to safety. And the way he does this is to reinforce his centre. Now white has every prospect of establishing a very strong pass pawn on d5, and hopefully the opportunity to crack open black's position with f4, which is why Kamsky has played e5 to try and dissuade white from this central advance. Bishop h5, very good. The bishop's not doing very much on e2, added to which, you never know, black might be going to go h5 and then h4. Maybe black isn't going to cast at all in this position. So bishop h5 scotches that idea completely, and now black has to castle. f4, excellent move. White is bossing black around here. The pass pawn on d5 is tying black up. Black would like nothing better than the time it takes to get his knight to d6. I mean, he really would like to have some time to manoeuvre his knight to that blockading square. But with f4, white is not really giving him that time. King g7, knight comes to f3, and now black has to resolve the problem of his pawn on e5. He doesn't really want white exchanging off the knight on f3 for the bishop on f6, so rook e8 is out of the question. Black has to take. So the game has an internal logic to it. We can see why the moves are being played, and I'm sure Kamsky could see, you know, the logic behind all of white's moves. But the fact is, he's got an unpromising position. He can't do much about them. He's got just to sit and hope that his position holds together. Well, knight e5, opening up fire against the weak pawn on g4. Black has to cede his valuable dark square bishop. No way does Kamsky want to have to do that, but he really has no choice. Rook c e8. Bishop f4. No need for white to rush. That knight on a5 is a long way from getting back into the game. And, well, white's central pawns are starting to look incredibly strong here. So black moves aside. Kamsky knows he's much worse in this position. He's thinking about creating counterplay with ideas such as bishop a6. But really, with his king so weak, this is something of a something of a pipe dream, really, as white moves in for the kill with accurate rook moves, a retreat of the bishop to h2 to facilitate rook f6. Then the bishop joins the party, forcing the other black rook passive, and now white moves in for the kill. Black's pieces are disjointed, none of them are displaying any activity whatsoever, so Aronian moves in with the excellent d6. Now let's not forget, d6 is a big concession. There's no way white would have played this move, you know, if he had seen a way for black to get his knight back into the game. Now black can play knight c6 and knight d4, but white is not going to give him any time at all to effect this manoeuvre. First he hits the rook, then he swings his own rook to join the attack in the attack on g4, King f8 running away, nothing black could have done. Bishop takes h6, black resigns. So that was a very convincing demolition job on the, how can I put it, the pseudo Grunfeld. I think that's the best way to describe black's system. Not quite a Grunfeld. And again, a game where the independent characteristics of the Reti or English setup was shown. Well, my next game will confirm that the English opening can be a purveyor of original effects. We turn our attention to the Israeli Israeli Championship, not Team Championship, played in Tel Aviv in 2002. Playing white is Grandmaster Leonid Goffstein, and playing black Alik Vaidaslava, who's a strong international master. And here we see the game veering off piste from an early stage with black playing bishop b4. Well, now bishop b4 in this situation has become quite common in master and grandmaster chess. It's quite an interesting move. Black is certainly threatening to double white's pawns. There's no doubt about it. He will play bishop takes c3 at the earliest opportunity. For instance, if white played knight f3, I've absolutely no doubt at all that black would whip off that knight and then play a move like d6. Now black is thinking about playing either a technical game where he continues with a better pawn structure, or he may be thinking sooner rather than later playing f5. You often see this motif in the Grand Prix attack versus the Sicilian. White loves to play bishop b5 and play bishop takes c6, after which the attack on the king side with f5 or f4 in that case proceeds rather more easily than it otherwise would do if black in the Sicilian is allowed to play knight d4. Well, here, you know, black sometimes delays the move f5, but he's certainly keeping it in mind in a position like this. Going back to bishop b4, I've marked the move f5 on the board there because I think it is a definite black intention in this line if you can get it in. And white would probably do best here to avoid the double pawns, hence knight d5 by Goffstein. Bishop a5. Well, I know that Shirov in this position has played bishop e7. I just see white getting the two bishops and a slight edge against this line. And I'm very happy about my future prospects involving the bishop on c1. So bishop a5 was Vaidaslava's move, and that is the way they tend to play this variation. But I'm not sure it's a great move, and white can probably take advantage of this by going b4. Now black has only got one good move to save his bishop, and that is the counter-attack with c6. Then we get a forcing line. White takes on a5, black takes on d5, white recaptures. But you know what? The reason I don't like this line for black is that white has extra pawns in the centre. He's got two bishops as well, and these two features of position mean that actually this is going to be quite uncomfortable for black. And we're going to see exactly how it works in this game. So black plays knight f6, queen a4, castles. Well, black can take this pawn on d5. This might contradict what I just said about the extra central pawn, but white's intention then is to go queen e4. The problem for black is, if the game opens up, white's two bishops are surely going to have their say, and in particular, this bishop on c1. This is the piece black doesn't have, the dark square bishop. So it's slightly problematic for black how he's going to deal with this bishop as the game continues. Hence, castles. e4, protecting both pawns, d6, and now bishop a3. A very strong move, preventing black from playing knight to d7, because of course after that, the d6 pawn will be hanging. So black's got to play a slightly artificial move here in order to get his queen side out, and Vaidaslava plays knight e8. Now, obviously, black could leave his knight on f6. I mean, he could play some move like knight a6. The trouble with that is bishop takes a6. White is happy to trade advantages. He gives up his bishop pair in order to play knight e2, bishop d7, and now queen b4. All as in the game Peterson versus Makropoulou in Athens, 1993. Then came rook b8, queen takes d6, queen takes a5, knight c3, rook fd8, and now queen c5, with an obvious advantage for white, who has by far the better pawn structure and a very powerful passed pawn on d5. So bishop a3, I think we can say, going back to the game, doesn't refute black's opening, but it certainly calls the opening into question, the opening variation. If black has to go knight e8, I really don't like it. Bishop b5, knight d7, rook c1. Well, it's all good stuff. Black has serious problems here completing his development. I mean, it's much easier for white to get his pieces into the game. Rook c1, well, that probably forces black to sacrifice another pawn in order to get the pieces going. Going back to knight d7, white previously played knight e2, as in an old game of Lobron. You might have wondered about bishop b5. Why couldn't black hit the bishop with a6? Well, that's exactly what black did in this game. White dropped back, queen h4. But white quickly built up an attack in this Lobron game by playing f4. And, you know, white has a very serious initiative in this game, in this position. Black has terrible problems combating the power of the dark square bishop. And knight g4 is obviously easily repelled with h3. And the game continues with white having a serious attack. But rook c1, this is also a good move, tying black up. And Vidaslava felt compelled here to play knight c5, which of course gives white the opportunity to snatch off another pawn. Now, obviously black could try a move like queen g5 here. That looks aggressive, and it attacks g2. Possibly white can think of sacrificing this pawn with knight e2, because of course after queen takes g2, you know, white is getting some serious pressure after rook g1. Queen must go to h3, and now I think rook g3 is very strong. The knight on d7 is under fire. Queen takes h2, I think he just snaps off the knight. Queen h1 check doesn't work, we just retreat. So that's not working for black. Hence after knight e2, black's probably got to go knight df6, and now we just go knight g3. Everything's covered, and we've got the two bishops. So knight c5 was the best black could see. White snaps off the knight. He's happy to give up his dark square bishop. He's gaining material. White goes 2 pawns up. And it's the quality of the pawns really that matter. It's not the pawn on a5 that makes the difference. It's the pawn on d5. Bishop d7. Queen b3. b6. Rook c3. Well, this perhaps looks slightly unusual. Going back to b6, what black's hoping for, of course, is that white's going to take this pawn and open up lines on the queen side. Now, I think, in view of the delay in development for white, this position could become dangerous for him. For instance, when white retreats with rook c3, black can play rook a4, hitting e4. He can force white onto the defensive with queen g5, and then just go rook e8. This is the coordination black can get very quickly if white grabs that pawn. So Goffstein makes a sensible and correct decision to give up one of his extra pawns and complete his development. So black takes the pawn, knight f3, rook b8, and now queen c2, monitoring the idea of rook b1 check, stopping it altogether. Rook b4, pawn up to d3, queen b6, and now white castles. Another sensible idea by white, again giving up his material in order to get a good position. White's quite happy. He was a couple of pawns up a few moves ago. He's given back those pawns, but he has excellent play now with knight d2. The idea, a very simple idea, is to place the knight on c4, and the knight on c4 is perfectly positioned, observing e5, perhaps manoeuvring to e3, and after that rook c7 follows. So black has to counter this regrouping plan. He does so by playing queen b4 and then bishop b5. Knight e3. The plan takes shape. White clears the c file for his rook, and the knight is coming to f5. Now the idea of knight f5 and queen g5 attacking g7 is certainly very dangerous for black. a4. Rook c8. a3. Black reasons that he had better get counterplay fast, and pushing the pawn is the best way that he can see to do this. Just going back to rook c8, if black had gone onto the defensive with a move like queen f8, well then I think we go rook takes e8, queen takes e8, and now I think just simply knight c4 it is a good move with the pawn on d5, a tower of strength. So rook c8 was played, a3 was played, knight f5. White's pressure is building. Immediate threats are queen g5, with g7 not so far away. g6. Queen f8 again was an option. Then we have rook takes e8, bishop takes e8, queen c7, g6, knight e7, and now d6. And this pawn is very difficult to stop. So, g6 was played in the game. Rook c7. The rook comes to an extremely active square. Rook f8. Queen g5. All of white's pieces suddenly come to the party. Queen b2. Knight h6 check. King g7. And now knight g4. The finish is swift and decisive. Black has no real counter to white's attacking thoughts on h6 and f6. So another one of those original games. I mean, I think we saw many different types of effects in this game, and it wasn't like a normal queen's pawn opening at all, and white won with a crushing attack. So in the end, excellent stuff by Goffstein. Now the symmetrical English is quite a tough nut to crack. Black doesn't really try to refute white's opening or confront white. He's not going to be ambitious. He's just going to lay out his game in a perfectly respectable manner and await events. Which brings us to the game Jan Timman playing white against Davor Paulo. He's graded 2.525, just in case you don't know him. And this was played in the Siegermann tournament in 2005. The opening, well, it's a typical English four knights symmetrical variation. Both sides developing very solidly against the legendary Timman. Paulo is happy to just copy white's moves and offer white the chance to play d4. Black intends to take that pawn. And so we get a variation here which could arise from the Fianchetto King's Indian, but most often comes from the English move order. And now it's up to white to prove an advantage. Why should white have any advantage at all in this position? Well, the answer lies in the c4 pawn. This gives white additional control of the centre. And in particular, it's difficult for black to break out with d5. The idea is that if black can't go d5, he never really gets the chance to free up his game completely. Therefore, white will always be operating with a slight space advantage in this position, conferred on him by the pawn at c4. We see this motif, control of d5, in a lot of English variations, but it's particularly acute in this line. If black can't break white's control of d5 in this variation, then white can get a stranglehold on the game. Well, there are many moves here, but Paulo's move is knight g4, which immediately attacks the knight on d4. So Timman just defends himself modestly with e3. When he plays this move, he understands completely that he's blocking in the bishop on c1. This is only a temporary state of affairs. White can redress this situation by simply going b3 and getting the bishop on b2 or a3 according to circumstances. d6. Well, that's a sacrifice, of course. Black understands perfectly that the knight on c6 is attacked. Going back, knight takes d4, e takes d4, and then knight h6 is another line, when black intends to bring the knight to f5 to pressurise d4. But nevertheless, I still believe in white's position there. I think it's quite easy for white to defend the pawn on d4 and keep his space advantage in the centre. So d6 is quite interesting, and even more interesting is Timman's response. He declines black's offer with b3. Now clearly white could take this pawn. He can go knight takes c6, for instance, and then go bishop takes c6. But black has a lot of play in this position after rook b8. He's got kind of Benko Gambit-like play. He may even be threatening bishop takes c3 to damage the pawns. He's got ideas of knight e5, followed by bishop h3. In general, grandmasters are unwilling to cede an initiative of this type in the opening. The other way to grab the pawn is, of course, bishop takes c6. But to me, that looks bad. White gives up a very valuable bishop. Black gets the chance to play his queen to a decent square, maybe c7, maybe d7. I think of the two moves, I slightly prefer d7. And in all cases, black is going to operate on the light squares in this position. White may well regret his decision to give up the bishop, even for a pawn. So Timon, just as I say, prefers a quiet move, b3, and Paolo goes knight ge5. Bishop b2, knight takes d4, e takes d4, and knight c6. So black plays a thematic manoeuvre to attack the d4 pawn. As we've seen in another line, he could have played his knight back to h6, intending knight f5. This is exactly the same idea, except that the knight has come back to c6 to attack d4. And now it's up to white to prove something in this position. Black's got less space than white, so really an exchange of pieces suits him. It's not at all easy to prove an advantage here with white, but Timon goes for it with d5. The good side to that move is that it stakes out a claim in the centre, and it pins down the e7 pawn. This is white's idea. He's going to play a rook to the e file and try and attack black along that file. Possibly he might move the knight on c3 out of the way and exchange off dark square bishops along the way. In general, if black is pinned down on the e file and dark square bishops are exchanged, white can look forward to a future kingside attack. The conditions will be ready for him. Black will be passive. So black has to fight against this plan. And Paolo does this by going knight to e5. If he goes knight d4 in this position, then I think white simply goes rook e1. And the plan has not been interrupted. So, knight e5. And now h3. A move with strategic intentions. White takes away the g4 square from black's knight and the bishop on c8. a6. Black is looking to break with b5 in this position if he can get that move in. So white immediately stamps himself on the position by playing queen e2. Not only is he coming to the e file, he's also trying to prevent black from playing b5. But after rook fe1, well, white's probably threatening f4 now, so black has to go into action with b5. This is the only logical move in this position. And, well, it kind of says to white, well, your queen move wasn't so good. The queen on e2 is vulnerable to attacks by my bishop. And I think probably if white took twice on b5, well, let's say with c takes b5, a takes b5, and now knight takes b5, black has very good compensation after bishop a6. You know, white's got to go a4, then black plays, for instance, queen b6, piling up on the pinned knight. Black has active play in this line. Of course, another line for white would be to take on b5 and then to go f4. Well, against that, black goes knight d7, and if queen takes e7, then again black gets pretty active play with queen b6 check, king h2, knight c5, knight d1, and now knight to d3. This is quite an interesting position. White can trade the dark square bishops, but black's knight on d3 is very, very strong. And again, black has compensation. So in keeping with his earlier play, Timon prefers to try to play aggressively himself rather than cede the initiative, and so comes out with c5. And the idea behind that move is that when black takes, as probably he's got to, I mean there's no real logical alternative to taking, he's got to take that pawn, white intends to play knight takes b5, uncovering an attack against the knight on e5. And you see after multiple exchanges, let's say black takes on b5 in this position, white takes on e5, we see the idea of pinning the e-pawn down is a very important one. So I think this will turn out quite well for white. Thus, black tries to break the shackles by going bishop take knight f3 check. There are further exchanges. Probably in this position, as I say, the exchange of dark square bishops is certainly going to favour white. And funnily enough, in this simplified position, now we see the idea of the kingside attack coming into play with h4, with black passive. That pawn on d5 really is restricting him. And I would say black has some problems in this position. Queen to d6 by black. Well, he could try to hold white up by playing h5. Then I think queen c3 is a good move. And I think white's actually going to win that pawn on c5. If black plays queen d6, well, the most simple move really is rook a c1. And it's not at all clear to me how black's going to defend that pawn. So, it seems as though this opening is working out very well for white. Note the cramping effect of the pawn on d5 and the black e-pawn on e7, which is just nailed down to the canvas really. Queen d6, rook e3, the pressure builds, bishop b7, and now h5. Rook fd8. Actually, white set a little trap there. Well, it's rather a transparent trap, really. If bishop takes d5, rook d1, and now e6. White has h6. The only move to stave off mate, really, is f6. And now we have the beautiful move, rook takes e6, undermining black's entire position. If he takes with the queen, he loses after bishop takes d5, and otherwise, he's losing material. So that's a nice way to prove white's advantage in this position. Thus rook fd8, h6. Black makes less concessions this way after queen f6, but white is happy to trade, and now the rook comes to d1. Two advantages for white, the passed pawn, and the pawn on h6 restrains black from doing very much because there will always be mating threats on the back rank to contend with. Thus, after king f8, white goes d6. He's happy to trade down into a rook endgame. In rook endgames, the most important features of the position are activity and the quality of pawns on show. White is very active. He's already hitting f6. He's forcing the black pawn forward. And now rook c3 highlights how passive black's position really is. The rook is hitting c5 immediately, and rook d5 is also a pretty serious threat. Black has to defend. Not nice. In comes the rook to d5. I think winning a pawn at least. b4, trying to buy white off. There are some exchanges. At least black gets rid of the passed pawn this way. But king g2, again, demonstrates that it's really not easy for black to equalise in this position. That double pawn on the king side is in effect a minus pawn. So what is actually happening here is that there are some exchanges, and now white has this strong passed pawn on b3. Not necessarily 100% win, but very, very uncomfortable for black. Rook a6. Black was in time trouble. Rook b8 check. King e7. Rook h8. Now it's getting really nasty. Going back to the position after rook takes b4, you might have wondered what would happen if king e7. Well, I think then white's best move is probably to confine the king with rook b6, just intending to bring his own king into the game. Not 100% win, as I say, but very, very uncomfortable for black. As it is in the game, getting the rook to h8 really is nasty for Paolo, because, well, once that pawn goes on h7, white's h-pawn becomes a giant. He tries king f6, of course white whips off the rook, and now black's intention was rook a8, freezing the effect of the white rook. However, Timon had anticipated this and played b4. Now black plays g5. Still in time trouble. He's trying to trap that rook or get it out of his guts by playing king g6 perhaps. Maybe he could have played rook b8 in this position. And after rook g7, f4. I think this is probably the best try to make a draw. And after that, I think the best move for white is g4. Then, if rook h8, we go b5, rook takes h6, rook g8, f3, king takes f3, rook h3 check, and over to b3. But after rook b8, king g5, f3, well, black is still a pawn down for nothing. Admittedly, after f5, you know, black has some chances, but white should still be better. Okay, g5 was played. b5, thank you very much. Rook f8. Rook g7. Contrast the effect of both rooks. White's got a very active rook and a passed pawn. Two passed pawns. The black rook is stuck. g4, trying to keep the white king out of the game. b6, rook h8, b7, rook b8 only move, king f1, rook e8, f3, enabling the white king to come into the game. G takes f3, and now really good move by white, g4. Black resigns. The point of g4 is that when black takes, white recaptures, and now the simple threat is h7 followed by rook g8. And there's not an enormous amount black can do about this. I mean, if he goes rook b8 in this position, well, just h7. And so, rather than see this variation on the board, Paolo decided to resign. So, nagging pressure for most of this game by Timon. Black was unable to equalise. Just goes to show in the English, control of d5 is very important. It's one of the main themes of this opening. And the idea is that black is cramped. He can't break free. Paolo never equalised, really. Maybe he could have held a draw in the rook ending, but that's hardly relevant to the opening play. Black's one particularly tough nut to crack in the English is the line where black treats the opening like a reverse Sicilian. We quickly get to the mainline position in the four knights. White goes g3. And now we've seen a brilliant example from Garry Kasparov after bishop b4. But what about d5? Now we come to the game Viktor Korchnoi playing white against Antonietta Stefanova, a very, very strong female grandmaster, 2-5-2-3. And this game was played in the Drammen Masters in 2005. I must admit, if I was white in this position, I have been here quite a few times, I would be feeling pretty pleased with myself. Firstly, there's an indirect pressure on the knight at d5. This is why black usually withdraws the knight at this point to get away from the action on that square. I would be feeling pretty pleased with myself because, you know, I've basically got an accelerated dragon with extra moves. There are obviously, if you imagine an accelerated dragon position with black, there are obviously lines within the classical framework where white can launch a kingside pawn storm because he has extra moves. Here, actions like f5 and g5 by black simply strike me as being premature, and white should be able to get a nice position against those with appropriate action on the centre, in the centre, and on the queen side. White is looking for ways to free the position. One way to do this is to play d4 in one go. I think this is another advantage of black retreating the knight to b6. He freezes the idea of d4 for the time being. But quite often in this line, white is also looking to play on the queen side with moves like a4 or b4, trying to gain time against the poorly placed black knights. Summarising, I think black has to be modest in his or her ambitions when they play this variation. Black can't just lash out. I think that knight on b6 is not a great piece just yet. But as long as black is modest, then, you know, a reasonable game should come about. Well, in this game, Korchnoi plays the very modern move, rook b1. Of course, white has plenty of other moves here. White can castle. That is one of the main lines, or white may simply play d3. With rook b1, Korchnoi keeps all options open, and maybe even threatens the move b4 very quickly. Certainly there are positions where if white can trade his b-pawn for the black e-pawn, then white will have an extra central pawn and possibilities of playing d4 and e4 a little bit later on. So rook b1 is the modern way and can be recommended. Okay, well, Stefanova is acutely aware of the fact that white is probably going to go b4 very quickly, and so she defends her pawn. I think this is a correct way. It shows an appreciation of the needs of the position, and it forces white to go back into quieter channels with d3, bishop e6, and now a3. And over the next couple of moves, both sides complete the development of their pieces. Both sides castle, and now white goes straight through with b4. Alright, white's got these extra moves on the accelerated dragon. Is he in any great shape to use these moves? Well, the only thing wrong with black's position as far as I can see is the position of his knight on b6. Everything else seems rock solid. You know, black is thinking about moves like queen d7, then possibly bishop h3, traditional ideas to strip out the fianchetto bishop. And, well, has jabs at the white pawn structure with moves like a5. And that's exactly what Stefanova played here. Black also has knight d4 in this position. One way to play this for black is to try and strong point the d4 square. Obviously, if white takes on d4, black gets a very strong pawn on that square. So knight d4 is also quite a good way to handle it. But Stefanova prefers to play a5 first, and after b5, only now does she play knight d4. Knight d2, a good move with twin aims. White thinks that he's got extra space, so he keeps the pieces on, and he immediately opens up fire on the pawn at b7. Bishop d5. Now, that struck me as being a little bit odd when I first saw this game. But when I took a closer look at the position, I begin to appreciate that black might have a few difficulties, believe it or not, defending that pawn on b7. For instance, if knight d5, I mean, that seems like the obvious move here. Then comes bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now, very strangely, the simple e3. And the black pieces on d4 and d5 are surprisingly clumsy. Black's going to actually lose one of them. For instance, if she goes knight e6, white goes e4, trapping the bishop. And going back to e3, if she plays knight f5, white goes e4. Now, I found that trap a little bit surprising when I first saw it. And a trap it is. But it is thematic. And it springs out of the fact that, you know, in the English, white has flexible central pawns. This is another feature of the English opening. White has options with his d and e pawns simply because he leaves them at home until the most propitious moment to push them. So, going back to knight d2, I guess she simply didn't want to play rook b8. I mean, it really is as simple as that. Black can probably get away with rook b8, but then you begin to wonder about the value of moves such as a5 in this position. And the knight on d4 looks ready to be pushed away with e3. So I imagine white would get some sort of small edge with a move like e3, knight f5, and then something like queen c2. Normal position, and well, black's pawns are slightly compromised here. So, bishop d5. And an equally peculiar reply from Korchnoi, bishop h3. Well, I wouldn't have thought too long about taking on d5. I mean, why not remove that strong bishop? But yes, there were a couple of Mihail Marin games, grandmaster from Romania, which went this way, and he wasn't able to prove much against this this continuation. For instance, in one game he went bishop b2 to stop the idea of knight c3. Black went a4, fixing the queenside pawns. He went bishop takes d4, e takes d4, and black had a reasonable position, opposite colour bishop position, with the knight coming to c3. So it's not that easy for white just to snap off that bishop and expect the advantage, which is why Korchnoi goes bishop h3, and now his idea is to play e3, of course, and make the black pieces in the middle, the minor pieces, look a bit weird. Bishop e6. Bishop takes e6. Korchnoi is not interested in the draw. He pins the knight, and black protects his knight with queen d7. Knight c4. Well, if white is down to that move, then I think black has equalised. And by rather strange means. The bishop coming to d5 struck me as being a bit odd when I saw it. But the problem with knight c4 is really that white is exchanging off black's worst placed piece. That knight on b6 is not ideal. And I think really Stefanova should just seize the opportunity with both hands, take off the knight and just play rook a d8. And what is wrong with black's position here? There's no real way for white to take advantage of the pin on e6. Meanwhile, black is well centralised. Who knows, maybe Stefanova was feeling ambitious. At any rate, she played bishop c5. Knight takes b6. And now black cemented the queenside pawns with c takes b6. Again, there are options. I mean, I think black could play bishop takes b6 in this position. Probably white's best then is a4. And the game continues, but with d4 under firm control, I think black is in good shape. But c takes b6. That's a sure sign that she's feeling ambitious. a4. Rook a d8. Knight e4. Well, you know, this is white's sole hope. The queen is still pinning that knight, so the knight comes to a nice central square, hoping perhaps to take off the bishop at the right moment. But black just parks the king in the corner, and I think she is okay here. Well, queen a2, stepping out of the way of knight d4. Black plays it anyway. Maybe this was the moment to play f5. I stated earlier that black had to be modest in his or her aims in the opening stages, but as black has effectively consolidated her position here, I don't see any reason why black shouldn't get ambitious and go f5. I mean, white can chop off the bishop, play bishop d2, b6, bishop c3. This strikes me as being sensible. But then just black plays knight d4. And I think black has the advantage here. Black is now the one with the advantage in space and more active major pieces. So maybe, who knows, f5 was the move. But she played knight d4. Bishop comes to e3. Queen comes up to d5. Rook comes to b2. And the pawn comes up to f5. Queen takes on d5. There are a couple of exchanges now. White takes on c5. And black recaptures with the b pawn. Now, the position is becoming simplified, but it's not simple. I mean, I think there are various ways for both sides to go wrong. For instance, if black had played rook takes c5 in this position, then f4 is quite an effective idea. White is getting to grips with the central pawn formation, and after rook d8, we have f takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, and now the key move, rook c2. When white has more active rooks, and of course he's threatening rook c8. This will be a typical way for black to stray into a poor rook and pawn endgame. But in the game, after knight takes c5, b takes c5, Korchnoi now gets the chance to display his endgame mastery, and he starts off with the move b6. b6 is excellent. It threatens bishop takes d4 at some point, or bishop d2, followed by e3, getting rid of the knight, and then rook to b5. At some stage, black has got to prepare herself for the invasion on b5. Knight e6. Well, I suppose black could go f4. I think Korchnoi would certainly have chopped off the knight. C takes d4, preventing rook b5. And then once again, white takes a c file. Again, white has the advantage because of this feature. Rook c7. You know, in rook and pawn endings, activity is the key and quality of pawns. Well, that pawn on b6 is a distinct danger to black here. So, knight e6 was played. White played f3, giving the bishop a little bit more room, taking more squares, and black played rook c8. Rook c1. Activity on the light squares is forthcoming, and black plays rook to d6. Rook b5, rook dc6, rook c4. And this move jams up the black position. Now I think the veteran grandmaster is getting the advantage in this endgame. King g8. Well, white's king is one square close to the centre. Black tries to redress the balance, and now white hits with f4. A good move, forcing black to cede the centre and diminish control over d4. G takes f4, g6, and now the time has come for white to take on a5. Black thought she prepared herself for that with rook takes b6, but now d4. The battle for d4 in this type of position is key, and with d4 actually white seems to have won it because black can't play rook c6 in this position due to the obvious d5. So after d4 she was down to rook d8, and now white gets the chance to take on c5. Suddenly Korchnoi has got the advantage. He's a pawn up, and although he's got a little bit of, how can I put it, he's got to get his rooks onto better squares. The rook on a5 is a little bit out of the game for the time being. Black's only try is to get active with rook b1 and then rook d1, but after rook c b4, pieces are coming off, and the check on f1 really doesn't do anything. I think white just moves the king, and well, it will come to the same. Black has to trade off a pair of rooks, which of course suits white. Knight d8 to protect b7 more than anything else. If rook d7 here, white has a5, cramping black for room. So knight d8, bishop comes to d4, gaining space, and black brings the king to e6. Naturally, knight c6 will be answered by rook takes b7 check. But after king e6, black is certainly intending to bring the knight to c6. The rook comes to b6. Knight c6 and white's bishop drops away. Black goes active with rook h1. But you know, a much more tenacious defence in this position was to drop back with rook d7. I think this was the way, and invite white to break through. I don't think it would have been easy for white to win this game after that. White hasn't got a passed pawn as yet. That will be his next task, to try to create a passed pawn. And, well, with all the black pieces on light squares, you know, the white bishop might not play much of a role. So I think that was by far the best move. I think going active with rook h1 only encourages white to play good moves, like king g3 and then king f3, rook h1. There's a little bit of toing and froing here. But, well, I'm not sure what black's activity is actually doing here. h6, nevertheless, of course, white has to create a passed pawn in order to win this endgame. So this is what Korchnoi is trying to do. h4. Black plays h5. Now, black could continue the active process with rook a1. Then comes rook takes b7, rook takes a4. And then rook h7, I think, is effective. And after rook on h5, then I think rook c7. This is good play by white here, and disjoints black's pieces. If king d5 in this position, we have rook g7, a strong move. So after rook c7, I think white now has the passed pawn and can push forward for the win. Something similar happens in the game, with black playing h5. White goes king f2, rook a1, rook takes, rook pins, king d5, and now rook b1 by Korchnoi. And we see that black's activity on the king side hasn't really done her much good. White threats rook d1, nudging the black king away from the passed pawn, followed by rook d6, and possibly rook g1 as well. So black has to cover everything with knight d4. Rook comes in behind the passed pawn, and the king drops back to c6. Now rook g1. King takes c5. This is an uncomfortable pin for black to go into. Rook a2, that was Stefanova's idea. And now bishop takes d4, king takes d4. And before we go on, I wonder if you can see Korchnoi's winning move in this position. Try and figure it out before listening to the remainder of this game. Well, Korchnoi played the excellent and very instructive move here, rook e6. I think this is a key idea. It stops the black king from entering the action, and white is simply threatening rook e5. And white has all the options now. Black really has nothing to do. She played rook a1. She could try rook a5 here, preventing rook e5, but white just goes e3 check, and methodically improves his position by putting his king on f3, and then swinging the rook round to g5. At an appropriate moment. So, going back to the game, rook a1, rook e5, rook h1, e3 check, king d3. The white rook nudges the black king away, takes on f5, plays rook e5, and the two passed pawns win the day. The game concluded. King d3, f5, rook h2 check, king f3, and Stefanova resigned. There is really no earthly way she can stop white from advancing the passed pawns in tandem. And Korchnoi has played hundreds of these types of endgames in his career. He knows exactly how to handle them. So what will be the point in prolonging the torture? Okay, but that was an interesting game. I mean, it did give some idea of black's prospects in the reversed dragon line. Not at all easy to play against this line. with white and expect an advantage. But you know, the English is not really one of those openings. As you saw in this game, Korchnoi was aiming for the long haul. He wanted to outplay Stefanova in a game of chess. He didn't want a theory session. Korchnoi basically avoided theory in this game and managed to get the upper hand eventually in a well played and well contested game. As long as black keeps his or her aims modest in this line, then, you know, a reasonable position should come about. There's nothing white can do about it. You've just got to sit down with the English and play chess. That is basically what the opening's all about. You can't rely on theory, certainly in a variation like this. My next game comes from the Porto San Giorgio Open, played in August 2009. Playing white, Grandmaster Vladimir Ipishin, and playing black, the Italian player Marcello Maloni. And this game will definitely show the variety of options available to white in the English. Ipishin, what do we know about him? Well, he's a strong, technical grandmaster. He makes his living going around open tournaments, beating up weaker players. He's an absolute genius at crushing the life out of weaker players. I mean, this guy with black, Marcello Maloni, is not weak. He's graded 2-2-7-1. Yet Ipishin in this game simply brushes him aside. Now, the move e3 is, well, it was very common a few years ago. These days it's less common than g3 in this position, or even a3. There are a number of options for white here. But it's dangerous. White takes away d4 from the black pieces. He's playing a reverse Sicilian. He is aiming to try to force the game into original channels. The point of Queen c2 really is to set up ideas such as a3 and knight d5. And in this line, surprisingly, white can often get a vicious kingside attack out of nowhere almost. Now, what Maloney does in this game is just to develop. I mean, he's playing the most natural moves under the sun here. All his pieces out, rook e8. But white hits with something very unusual. Bishop d3. There's also, I believe, queen f5 in this position. This is also an interesting move. And I'm not sure whether the fangs have been drawn of that move in theoretical terms. But certainly the idea of knight takes f6 is inconvenient for black. This position was debated quite a lot a few years ago. And it is quite messy. White's threat basically is knight g5. I mean, he wants nothing other than to get a really dangerous attack going more or less straight away. So that's why knight takes d5 in this position would be inconvenient for black. The e-pawn is falling, and d6 doesn't really help matters after queen h5. It's a very strange position, but black has all the problems here. Knight e7, knight g5. You can see how quickly a white attack can build. It's very strange. But bishop d3. Now there are definite threats to h7, so black tries to cover these by going h6. White castles. If black plays e4 in this position, he simply loses a pawn to knight takes f6. So Maloney gets his bishop out of the way. And now a3. Just a quiet move. And you can see white has already set up a very obscure situation. If it wasn't a grandmaster, you'd be thinking, well, what the heck is that bishop doing on d3? But black has some problems developing his pieces. White's control of d5 is preventing black from freeing his game. A typical English motif. We've seen it before. d6. Knight takes f6 check. Queen takes f6. And now Ipishin plays bishop e4. As a prelude, I think, to expanding in the centre. I mean, white's idea really is perhaps b4, bishop b2, and then d4. And the idea of the bishop on e4 is a strange one. I think when white plays d4, he doesn't really want black playing e4, so the bishop on e4 simply stops that. Knight e7. Well, a withdrawal, but we can see what black is doing. He wants to play bishop f5 and exchange off the light square bishop. He's a bit worried with the idea of the central expansion plus the activity of that light square bishop, so he's coming round to exchange it off. But of course this gives white the opportunity to play d4 straight away, which is what Ipishin does. And from his opening variation, white now enjoys, I think, a slight advantage based on more space and better prospects ready for the middle game. b4, bishop b2 will certainly give black some problems. Queen e6. Does black really want to play f5 in this position? Bishop d3. Knight g6. And now d5. Efficient presses the accelerator, and now white suddenly comes up with the idea of a kingside attack, more or less, as I say, out of nowhere. The only problem with black's position is very solid, but there's not a lot of counterplay to be seen on the horizon. Black's kingside pieces are passively placed. I mean, that knight on g6 not really doing anything. Meanwhile, white comes forward with the idea of kingside attack. He first of all manoeuvres his knight to g3, exerting control over the central squares, and then his idea really is to play e4 and f4. Possibly f4 is the main threat to black right now. Bishop e7. Well, I'm not sure I would have done that, but black is getting very worried about the passive state of his pieces. Having said that, well, I don't know. To me, knight h4 looks just about forced. Obviously, there was something about that black didn't like. Possibly the fact that the knight isn't really doing anything on h4 and it's got no retreat. No retreat worth mentioning. I mean, I think after that, white would probably just go f4 anyway, and enjoy a definite advantage. Once the bishop gets round to c3, rook comes across to e1, we can see white has all the dynamic possibilities. But I think it was better than surrendering a pawn. I mean, this is a typical dodgy open tournament decision by black. He can't see any other way to get active, so he just jettisons a pawn and hope that something will turn up after rook f8. Needless to say, it doesn't turn up, and from now on, Epician is remorseless. He comes in with the threat of mate, then he plays e4, suddenly getting his bishop into the game and threatening bishop takes h6. Black can see nothing better than to play bishop g5, but now white moves in for the kill with f4. There are some exchanges, and some more exchanges. But really, black, I think, when he looked at this position, couldn't see anything to do. So he just resigned. I mean, basically, it's an amazing position. You know, black hardly has any moves at all. He can't take the rook because of mate. If he defends the position with queen e7, well, white just continues to build up. And it's noticeable that in the final position, black hasn't even moved his queenside pieces. Another one of those positions in the English where the domination of the centre by white, and in particular the control of d5, froze black in the opening. It forced him passive and enabled white to dominate the play. Well, a simple enough game to understand once we've seen it, but not so simple to play. That was the Grandmaster's technique on show, and we can learn a lot from games like this. Well, my next game is very, very recent. I'm recording this in October 2009, and this game was only played in the same week that I'm actually making this recording. It's a game from the European Club Cup, and it's between Lev Aronian and Yevgeny Alexeyev. So two players over 2700. And Aronian begins with his favourite English opening. And this time, black plays a very solid defensive formation akin to the Queen's Gambit or Catalan with e6 and then d5. So how does white go about playing this position? Well, Aronian just develops his pieces in solid style, and black plays his bishop out to e7. Both sides castle, and now white is faced with a fundamental choice. Should he play d4 and go back into the Catalan, or should he play a move like b3 and keep the game within the confines of the Reti or the English? Well, I have mentioned on a couple of occasions on this DVD that transpositional qualities abound in the English. You can virtually go back into Queen's Pawn openings at any stage, and this is what Aronian does here. So this is our first taste of the Catalan. It's a positional opening, a squeezing opening, where basically white tries to freeze black's activity and hold position by creating activity down the long diagonal and trying to pin black down to the defence of his queen side. There is a lot of theory on the Catalan. It has been played extensively in Grandmaster chess. It's still a worthwhile way for white to play. as Aronian shows. Well, queen c2 is coming to take the pawn off. And now black plays a6. That's a traditional response. And after queen takes c4, black's going b5. White can do that, but Aronian prefers to play a4, keeping more life in the game. And making it slightly more difficult for black to free himself on the queen side. Alexeyev goes through with a traditional manoeuvre, bishop d7, queen takes c4, and now bishop c6. As we've seen, the queen's bishop can become something of a liability for black, so Alexeyev activates this bishop right away. Of course, he's a little bit cramped. He's got the typical queen's gambit defect of the pawn on c7 still being at home, so it's difficult for black to get his major pieces into active locations whilst that pawn's still on the board. You know, black would like nothing better than to take that pawn off the board and then put his rooks on the c and d files and maybe his queen on somewhere like b7. But it takes a heck of a long time to do that here. White has more freedom to start with, and Aronian is very adept in this type of position. Alright, a5. Black is making room for his knight to come to a6. A knight on d7 would only jam up the position even more. And black notes that the move a4 did not come without a drawback. He could possibly put his knight in on b4. A nice outpost. Bishop takes f6. Looks like a rather gratuitous exchange. But of course white wants to take the centre. I mean, Aronian wouldn't have just given the bishop pair away without an idea in mind. So his idea is simply to cramp black by taking the central squares. And Alexeyev can't really do much about the centre. He's just got to monitor it with the two bishops. So he puts his knight into the nice square b4. Now white's next task is to find the best squares for his rooks. You know, looking at this position, I thought, well, maybe d1 and e1 are good squares for the rooks. But Aronian plays his f rook to d1. This suggests he thinks he's got to keep the rook on a1 at home for the time being. And well, his top priority really is to get his central pawns going. So he's looking at ideas such as d5 now, e5, to drive black the back bishops. g6, h4, excuse me, slip of the mouse. Yeah, h4. So just probing black's position, taking away the g5 square. Maybe white's thinking about h5, maybe not. At any rate, black goes bishop g7, drops away. And white pushes on with h5. b6, anticipating d5 by white, giving the bishop a little bit more room. H takes g6, softening up the black king position, and black keeps his pawns together with h takes g6, after which white plays knight to h2. So white has ambitious intentions in mind. Queen d7. And now e5. Very good. After bishop takes g2, king takes g2. Now white is definitely thinking about a plan such as knight e4, knight g4, and then a knight to f6. White is essentially playing around the knight on b4. He's ignoring it. He's saying to black, well, your knight is not doing anything. It looks nice, but actually what is it doing in this position? So black really has to find an accurate counter to white's upcoming attacking plan. c5. The classical breakout attempt by black. Alexeyev sees that white can play d takes c5, but he's intending to answer this with queen c6 check. Knight f3, and now rook fd8. Oh well, at least black seems to have intercepted white's plan for the time being. Queen h4. White is still thinking about and attacking ideas on the king side, starting with knight e4. And he gets the queen on the business side of the knight. Rook comes into d3. Knight e4 anyway, and b takes c5 was answered by rook a c1. Well, everything's hinging on whether white can control the position. You know, black is trying to get as active as he can to dissuade white from this ongoing idea of attacking the king. And it looks as though black has succeeded for the time being. I mean, that rook on d3 is a bone in white's throat. The knight on b4 looks good. The queen looks good on c6. But black has some problems with his pawn structure, and it's not at all easy actually to rebuff white's overall scheme of attack, whatever black does. So black played king f8. Now he could have taken on d1 in this position, and after rook takes d1, play his knight to d5. That was another way. After knight f6, perhaps only then black could play king f8. Of course white is still a little bit better in this position, but well, black would have made white work for it at least. Going back to the game then, king f8 was played. Rook takes c5. Rook takes d1. Interesting turn of events. Rook takes c6. Knight takes c6. Why has white sacrificed the queen for 2 rooks? Sorry, I was trying to get to grips with the unusual material balance here. But white had an intention in mind. He wanted to play his knight into f6. And now, the threat of queen h7 is very difficult to stop. It's quite surprising, of course. Aronian is not going to give up his queen for 2 rooks. He's not going to give up 2 rooks for his queen, unless he's got something very clear to do. So queen h7 is the threat, and black can't see what to do against it. He plays rook b8. We just go back to knight f6. Let's see if black can improve the defence with bishop takes f6. Well, I think after that we go e takes f6, and then black has to do a runner with king e8. Then of course queen h8 is an easily winning move. Nothing fancy. White just comes across and takes the rook. So going back to the game, rook b8 was played. Queen comes across to c4. Black is not being given time to connect his rooks, get his pieces together, and now white moves in for the kill with knight g5. Bishop takes f6. Black does not want to investigate. Knight e7. Knight gh7 mate. That would have been a rather humorous finish. So, going back to the game, bishop takes f6 was played. E takes f6. And now rook d4. Queen a6. The squeeze is on. Everything is directed towards preventing black from connecting his pieces, especially his rooks. 2 rooks work well together when they're protecting each other. Here, the queen is causing a lot of disruption to the black rooks. Of course, beyond the black rooks is the black king, and that is black's main problem. You know, black cannot coordinate his pieces, nor, ultimately, can he protect his king. Rook c7, trying to hold things together. Queen b6, continuing to hassle the rooks. And black retreats with rook d7. So he has connected his rooks in the end, but not in the way he would have liked to. Just going back to queen b6, well, what else is there? I mean, if he plays rook c8 in this position, then queen b7 is very strong, threatening the rook and checkmate. And there's no way out for black after that. So I think black has got to go rook d7, but now with the rooks passive, this gives white something of a free hand. Knight h7 check, an excellent move. You often find that players of the English or flank openings such as the Reti are really excellent tacticians. You know, they start quietly, but they go through the gears as the game continues. And when tactical complications come about, they really are on top of them. Now in the game, of course, Alexeyev's got, well, he's stuck between a rock and a hard place here. He played king g8. If he goes king e8 in this position, I'm afraid queen c5 is very awkward to meet. The threat of queen f8 is crushing. And if knight e7, then perhaps the surprising move here, queen a3, wins the game. Steps aside from the attack of the rook, and black can't move his knight. So black is actually losing material here, and of course it would be rather easy to win with the queen and knight plus the attack against 2 rooks there. So king g8 was played. Maybe Alexeyev thought he was getting out of this, but now superb move, queen to e3. King takes h7, what else? Queen h6 was coming, and now the beautiful point, g4. I really like this point to finish off. Black's got 3 pieces, but his poor old king has no defence. The white queen moves him for the kill, and there's no force on earth that can stop him from doing so. Black resigns. I think that was a superb game. A positional squeeze where Black's every attempt to break out was dealt with very roughly indeed. And the finish, of course, quite superb. What does this teach us? Well, I think it highlights another quality you might need to play the English opening. The English opening starts out slowly, builds up, and tactics can occur a little later on. So I think players of the English should be tactically alert in the middle game. If you don't consider yourself a good tactician, then maybe the English is not for you. I'm not sure. Aronian looked like he played this game extremely positionally, but in fact it was a tactical masterpiece in the end. What then have we learned about the English in this small investigation? Well, I think we've learned that the English is a very individual opening, or at least it can be. It's an opening for all seasons, in the sense that white can choose between striking out on an independent course or perhaps taking advantage of the many transpositional possibilities that there are available to white to go back into some sort of regular queen's pawn openings. We've learned, I think, that tactics tend to come later rather than sooner in the English, and that the English is a really excellent opening for beating weaker players. Lots of grandmasters use it as their main weapon in open tournaments when they want to simply brush weaker but dangerous opponents aside without giving them the possibility to start tactical complications. Usually players of the English will be good tacticians because, when central expansion is delayed, the tactics tend to come in the middle game rather than immediately in the opening. So the English can be played by everybody. I think for club players it's a good weapon. I think studying thematic games is an excellent way to learn an opening, if you like, learn the initial ideas about the opening and behind the opening. And I hope this small investigation has encouraged you to go out and try the English for yourselves. Certainly you'll need to do some more research on the opening, but just from the stuff you've learned on this DVD, I think you can actually go and play the opening at club level. Why not? I mean, it's a solid, reliable way to play with white. And you'll probably find your appreciation of chess improves as a result, because the English is also strategic, and this idea of gripping the centre and then expanding in the centre a little later on, this is really good for improving your chess. Which brings me now to my final game, and it's from the Dubai Open in 2004. Playing white is Shakira Mamijarov, who's graded 2657, and playing black Merab Gagunashvili. And this game will conclusively demonstrate that black cannot play in a vague manner against the English. If he just hopes to equalise by playing in a simplistic way, he just won't be able to do this. The opening we recognise, it's the 4 knights, where white plays g3, and now black comes out with this move bishop b4, bishop g2, and now the very simplistic move, bishop takes c3. Black's sole intention when he plays like this is to double white's pawns. I mean, it really looks as simple as that. And then he's hoping to go to work against the white pawn structure, a little later on. It's a strategy borrowed from the Nimzo Indian. But white hasn't played d4 yet. So the pawn at c4 can be reinforced with d3. And it's not that easy for black to take advantage of the double pawns. In the Nimzo Indian, the c4 pawn with focal point of black's attention. Here, it's got to be the c3 pawn, which is very difficult to get at. So, to cut a long story short, white has all the advantages of the typical English setup here. He's got 2 bishops, and he's got firm control over d5. Gegunashvili played h6. Well, black can try to start some action with e4. I think knight d4 is good after that. And whether black takes on d3 or not, I think white has a slight advantage after knight takes d4 and now c takes d4. 2 bishops, a lovely bishop on g2, rook b1 coming up. Potential activity for the bishop on c1, unlimited. So black plays h6, trying to keep the bishop out of g5, and now white plays rook b1. freezing that bishop on c8. We've seen this idea quite a few times. And black just plays rook b8. e4, firmly gripping the centre. Now the square d5 is completely off limits for the black pieces, and white's idea is basically to start a kingside attack by moving his knight on f3, followed by f4. It really is as simple as that. Black plays bishop e6, perhaps shaping up for queen d7 and bishop h3. So white stops him by playing h3. Actually, white could probably have allowed that. I mean, he could play a move like knight h4 just allowing black to do his stuff. You know, f4 is good, bishop h3, and now bishop takes h3 followed by knight f5. I mean, this looks pretty nice for white to me. That knight is very strong. Black's queen, well, I mean, it's out of play. Knight g4 looks totally useless after queen e2. White's just got a nice position here as well, but h3 keeps more life in the game, and of course now queen d7 is going to be answered by king h2. So black changes tack with knight d7, and now white gets ready for the advance of the f pawn with knight h4. Black goes knight e7, and now white plays queen e2. He could go f4 straight away. Probably after that black would take and go f5. So queen e2, just keeping options open. Who knows, maybe d4 is a possibility now. Black went f5. He takes f5. This looks dangerous, opening up lines for white's bishop pair. And Mamijarov plays knight f3, keeping the pieces on. He could have gone knight takes f5 and then taken on b7. Black's idea against that was to take on b7 and then to take on h3. And whilst white is still a bit better here, it's not an enormous amount. So knight f3, keeping the pieces on, and after queen f6, knight d2. Here we see the very good central control that white has managed to establish here. The knight heads for a beautiful square on e4, and it can't be budged by d5. White is still controlling those central light squares very effectively. Queen g6, king comes over to h2, and now black plays rook b e8. How can we describe this position after f4? Not quite equal. Black's position looks nice, but white has the bishop pair, and he's got a very strong knight on e4. Positional advantages, which actually black is finding it difficult to shake off. Rook b e1. Knight f6, white takes on f6, black recaptures with the rook, and now pawn comes up to g4. And as usual, when positional pressure is exerted on even a strong opponent, mistakes can occur. And black makes a mistake now with knight h4. I mean, what he should play in this position is just to retreat with knight e7. A loss of face, yes, and white still has the advantage, but it wouldn't be as bad as the game when after knight h4, white went in with bishop c6, and now I think white's advantage has just increased dramatically. The main point of bishop c6 is that black can't block with bishop d7. White then goes in for the kill with a queen sack, and after rook takes e8 check king h7, he's got bishop e4, which after knight f5 leads to a winning position for white after rook a8. The white rook just moves out of the way, and the light square bishop on e4 is the king of the board. So that's one cute variation where black goes down in flames. Obviously black could play rook e7 here, but then bishop e4 is strong, and if queen e8, g5 does the business. Suddenly black's pieces are being made to look very, very clumsy. So in the game, after bishop c6, rook ef8 was played, but now white retreated with bishop g3, highlighting the fact that the knight on h4 was really in a predicament. Black traded off the rook. Well, if he goes bishop d7, hoping to neutralise the effect of white's bishop by bishop takes d7, knight f3, well then I think rook takes f3 is sufficient, and then bishop c6 is a withdrawal, which in fact wins the game because bishop e4 is coming next. So black's got to trade, and trade again, and play queen g5, but now came a cute finish. Queen e1. a crushing double attack on e6 and h4. Black has no defence. Black resigns. A nice game by Mamijarov. A game where Black was unable to equalise completely. So that brings us to the end of our investigation into the English. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to this wonderful opening, and that you'll go out and try the English for you. Well, that's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed our small investigation and introduction into the delights of the English opening, and that you will consider employing 1c4 in your game. Certainly if you do, I think you can look forward to some really interesting chess. So for now, it's International Master Andrew Martin signing off. I'll see you next time. Until we meet again, the very best of luck.